Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for the 2nd of July, believe it or not, where we are talking about the ending of the semester, incidents in the life of a slave girl, and the awakening. And if you can see with the dates below, this upcoming Thursday when we would normally have class, we won't be having class because it is the 4th of July. So there is no class scheduled, which means our very last class of the semester before our final exam is next Tuesday, a week from today. So I thought I might jump ahead a little bit and talk a bit about the awakening, and then in our last class on Tuesday of next week, I can put some closure onto both incidents in the life of a slave girl and the awakening. So that means that you'd get some background on the awakening today if it turns out that you thought you might want to write your second paper about the awakening. And your second paper is going to be due on July 11th at 9 a.m. And the reason for that would be that your final exam will be posted on the 11th at 9 a.m. so that you can devote yourself completely to the final examination. And as you know, normally an in-class face-to-face final would be 2 to 3 hours. But since this is an online class, I will give you 24 hours which to finish the exam, which will be an essay exam that's open book and open notes. However, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours working on that exam. I would expect that you would spend 2 to 3 hours. Understanding, of course, that your responses won't be as developed or as polished as something that you might do in a paper. But you still should be able to synthesize all of the major points that we've been talking about. In terms of revisions for paper number 1, if you are going to do a revision for paper number 1, that would be due by the 11th at 9 a.m., which is basically the ending of our class before the final examination. I ask that you submit in the original evaluated copy with my comments along with your revision, and I will compare and contrast the two, and you will get the higher of the two grades. So if you still have not submitted in paper number 1, then you definitely want to reach out to me about what's going on, as we are nearing the very ending of our semester. And as you know, with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we had talked about how different this text is because we're getting a true story, and we are also getting a story of slavery. All of the other pieces that we've been reading have been about people who are rather privileged and comfortable, even Jane Eyre. And that, unfortunately, because Incidents is a true story, it is a very uncomfortable read, but it is a very important read. And I had left you with the question that perhaps is unanswerable for our attendance about which is, in your opinion, the most hypocritical act that occurs in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And of course, the entire text is filled with hypocrisy and cruelty and degradation, which is what slavery is all about. But if we were to move forward to something like the awakening, and you note that I have put our text in chronological order so that you could see a little bit of the progression, the awakening should remind you of the beginning of the semester, not that that was a piece of chronological order when I had assigned The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin as our initial reading. I wanted to assign that story first to give you a little taste of Kate Chopin's style, but secondly to use that short story that's about a page and a half or so as an example of how one could go about reading literature. And then we, of course, have utilized those skills throughout the entire semester. And some texts have been longer than others, and that has required a little bit more time. My hope is that at this point in the semester, you are caught up with the readings so that you can really devote yourself to thinking about paper number 2. And In terms of The Awakening, the good news is that we don't have a novel. We have something called a novella. So it is longer than a short story, but it won't be as long as an actual novel. So it's certainly not going to require the same time and energy that something like, let's say, Jane Eyre required. Chopin was barred and ostracized after writing this text, The Awakening, and it's a good title because basically our main character, Edna, is experiencing awakenings on a number of levels, physically, emotionally, intellectually, socially. So that could be a paper topic if you're still searching for paper topics. I, of course, had utilized the quote from our very first reading, The Cult of True Womanhood, about how a book could ruin a girl. And I hope that the texts that we've examined over the course of the semester illustrate that, because we have authors who are making subtle and sometimes not so subtle commentary about the repressive society for female at the time period. But I think none of the texts we've read have been so blatant and so obvious as Chopin's text. And Chopin herself as an author lived an unorthodox life. I guess you could say that for all of the female authors in some respect. But certainly, I think we have some female authors. Dickinson is a great example, who lived a particularly unorthodox life. Chopin wasn't like Dickinson in the sense that she isolated herself from society, but she was like Dickinson in that she didn't live up to many of the expectations of her time period. Chopin, for instance, was bored with parties. And think about the world of persuasion and how ultimately that is the be-all, end-all. Chopin read literature, and again, we see how dangerous reading can be. And Mary Shelley, for instance, was a voracious reader. In fact, she was married to Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet. So she had a great background in literary texts and was able to utilize that in her own writing. Chopin smoked cigars, which would still be considered unusual during this time period. And if you know anything about Freudian psychology, I had talked a little bit about this when we were talking about Rochester and Jane Eyre. The cigar is oftentimes seen as a phallic symbol. That's not to say that it's always a phallic symbol, but definitely there is this idea of Chopin living a very non-traditional life that in some ways was rather male-centric. She would spend a good amount of time alone and would walk alone. She insisted on her privacy. Again, think about how unusual that would be for someone like a Mrs. Mallard, who went to her room by herself. She dressed unconventionally. And we had talked about this a little bit with The Cult of True Womanhood, and how dress reform was really a way to break out of some of the repressive natures of society, or some of the repressive expectations of society for female. She ran the family plantation after her husband's death. By all accounts, she had a good marriage. Yet, again, we don't necessarily know what went on behind closed doors. We do know, with just the two texts that we've read, The Story of an Hour and now The Awakening, that she does talk about female characters who feel trapped within marriage. Whether or not that's autobiographical or not is really, in many respects, irrelevant. Because ultimately authors can create fiction. So if that was not necessarily her particular situation, it could be her reflection on the situation of other females around her during the time period. What we see in The Awakening, it's in a way that perhaps we have never seen before in any of the texts we've read, this sense of self-assertion, of repressed sexuality. And this is something that's been sort of hinted at, in Jane Eyre, that the idea that she couldn't be with St. John is because she didn't feel any kind of erotic passion for him. And he, more importantly, didn't feel any towards her. And, of course, in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we talked about the threat of imposed sexual union on slave girls at the time. We see an incredible sense of independence, intellectual, as I had indicated, emotional, and physical. And I wanted to just highlight a few of the major pieces of the books. And it is divided up into separate books. Each book is a kind of section. And again, I realize you may not necessarily be done with The Awakening, but I wanted to make sure that I had covered this material before the 4th of July, because we aren't going to be meeting again, so to speak, until next week. And I realize this information can be useful to you over the weekend. And book one, if you're a careful reader, and Chopin, as you know, is very attentive to detail. We saw that with Story of an Hour. We get imagery of a caged bird. The caged bird is supposed to represent Edna. That's speaking an incomprehensible language, also representing Edna. That she's trying to state her dissatisfaction, but no one understands. What the bird is saying in another language is, get out. The idea is that this is what Edna is trying to do, is to get out of her repressive society and the expectations of her society. It's also the author who's trying to get out a message. I don't know if you're familiar with the Jordan Peele film, Get Out, but that's a pun. Get Out works on a number of levels, including getting out the message. One of the things we see in our main character is that there's a great emphasis on swimming, something that Edna cannot do at the beginning of the novel, which is supposed to show the lack of independence that she has. And swimming, of course, is also associated with the ocean. And the ocean, it can be very seductive, as well as very cleansing and reminiscent of imagery such as the womb. And in many ways, Edna is being reborn throughout this story, as if she's coming out of the womb. And think about the sea, the ins and outs of the tide, and the sexual imagery associated with that. At the very beginning, she's swimming without her wedding rings. Of course, the wedding ring is supposed to represent the idea of her perceived repression or entrapment within marriage. And not swimming with the ring is supposed to be representational of freedom. And in book 3, we learn a little bit about her husband, Mr. Pontellier, and he's disappointed that his wife isn't interested in his concerns and isn't more attentive to the children. Again, think about the cult of true womanhood and how a woman should ultimately devote herself to her husband. And that he looked forward to leaving his family because they're on vacation right now. He looked forward to leaving his family for the excitement of work in the city. And how many times have we had commentary throughout the texts we've read, whether Jane Eyre or Persuasion, that women need to be active, they have the same feelings as men. In book 4, as a contrast to Edna, we learn about Madame Ratignolle. Again, this is a story about French Creole society. And Madame Ratignolle, for her, what's risky behavior is selecting a bonbon that could be too rich and might hurt her. So in other words, she very much falls into the stereotype of the mother-wife that Edna can't fall into. In book 5 and 6, we're told a little bit more about the sea, how it's a seductive force that's symbolic of many things, including the womb. The sea can cleanse, it can rejuvenate, it can caress, and it can offer freedom and escape. And this is where Edna begins to realize her position as an independent being. Again, no parallels with something like The Story of an Hour, where basically what we have is a character who's realizing that the societal expectations for her aren't the only options that are available. In book 7, a seemingly minor action, Edna removes her collar and opens her dress at the front. This is supposed to be a symbol of freedom. And we learn a little bit about her marriage, that it was, for lack of a better term, a good match, which is something we talked about in Persuasion. She has a passionless marriage to Mr. Pontellier, who's older than her and is able to provide her with a very comfortable financial life. And he's not a bad husband, but she doesn't necessarily feel any kind of emotional or personal connection to him. and that she's fond of her children in an uneven way. Again, the exact opposite of how society says that a mother should feel about her children. And then one of the women that Edna meets, Madame Reese, very different than Madame Ratignolli. And Mademoiselle Reese, Mademoiselle being that she is not married, which of course is unusual for the woman of a time period such as this, as opposed to a Madame Ratignolli, who of course is married because she's a Madame. But Mademoiselle Reese, another woman that Edna encounters in the story, is very unusual for the time period because she hasn't married and she lives a rather isolated, independent life, and she embraces the arts. And one of the things she does is she plays music, Chopin. A little bit of a pun here because Kate Chopin wrote the text, but Chopin is also a classical musician. Edna is struck by the passion of the music and completely overcome. Think about the power of the arts, whether it be literature, as we've been discussing over the course of this semester, or whether it be music, or whether it be art. Again, this is one of the ways that individual can self-express and can encourage audience members to reflect and question. It's one of the reasons why I suspect the arts and the humanities are under such attack nowadays, because they serve as a kind of threat to the status quo, or could serve as a threat to the status quo. They encourage you to think and question. So in book 10, Edna learns how to swim. I think it's quite interesting that all of the males give themselves credit for her ability to learn. Never once does anybody consider that perhaps this is of her own doing. But swimming is supposed to represent independence and power. Book 11, we see Edna and her husband have a battle of wills. And it seems like what they're arguing about is quite minor. Who will go inside the house first? It almost reminds me of those old cliches that if a couple happens to be arguing about socks on the floor, it's not really about socks. It's representational of something that's much more important. Ultimately, Mr. Pontellier wins and he goes into the house first. But this shows that Edna is beginning to defy her husband and the societal expectations of her time. And we might say that this is the battle before the war, because this will continue over the course of the novel, where Edna and her husband are basically in opposite camps. So much so that when Edna is not acting according to convention, and this, I'll skip ahead a little bit. This is in chapter 17. She refuses to take callers on Tuesdays afternoons, for instance. Again, think about the importance of taking callers when we talked about with persuasion. That Mr. Pontellier is just so shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties. He's wondering if she's mentally unstable. And I can't help but think of the Dickinson documentary that we watched. And we talked about the Mad Woman in the Attic, which was literally represented by the Bertha character. Not that necessarily Bertha is supposed to evoke our empathy. It's supposed to be Jane Eyre. Which is why reading something like While Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice is so important, I think, because then we can get the perspective of Bertha, not from the same author. Obviously, Bertha's a fictional character, but her story is fascinating. The idea of ultimately that if a woman in one way or another defies convention, she must be insane. And I think I've mentioned to you that I teach a horror film class. There's one film that we watched from the 1940s called Cat People. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers. If you've never seen it, I encourage it. But we talk about just that very thing, where in the 1940s we have a woman who basically is defying the conventions of the time, and her husband's first response is that, well, perhaps she needs to be institutionalized. So as much as things change, they remain the same. Nevertheless, Edna has in book 13 sensual awakening, before taking a nap while stretching out in a bed. And of course, this is about Edna understanding her physicality and her sexual nature. And again, something that was not considered appropriate for female, as we saw in the Cult of True Womanhood. And then when Edna awakes hungry, she's literally hungry. She wants food, but she's figuratively hungry as well. She's hungry for sexual fulfillment. She's hungry for independence. She's hungry for breaking out of the stereotypical roles of female. Of course, what we're introduced to when Edna is on vacation is that she meets someone, Robert, who is closer to her in age, and they get along quite well, and they seem to be, in many ways, quite suited for one another. Robert is supposed to be a bit of a playboy, but it seems that Robert is truly attracted to Edna, and Edna is increasingly attracted to Robert, despite the fact that she's married. So when Robert leaves town, because he realizes that his feelings are growing, and then at the ending of their vacation, when people return back to their homes, that what he's not going to be able to do is to have any kind of real relationship with Edna. He decides to leave town. This is when Edna realizes, at least initially, that she's infatuated with him. Edna says in book 16, I think this is quite an important quote, that she would never sacrifice herself to anyone, even her children, although she would give up her life for them. And the distinction between dying for one's children, but not necessarily losing one's integrity, not necessarily losing one's ability to be oneself, is something that we've seen in incidents in the life of a slave girl as well. Edna, as I had said in book 17, refuses to take callers, and there's a great scene in there where they're having dinner and Mr. Pontellier keeps seasoning his bland soup, which is supposed to be a symbol for his bland life, and the bland life that they have as well. And Edna wants passion. Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, again a symbol of her entrapment in marriage, but the maid returns it to her. Again, think about the kind of privileged life that Edna is living if she's got a maid. Despite that, she doesn't envy the domestic harmony of, let's say, the Ratignolis, who seem to be quite content with this comfortable, passionless life, as is talked about in book 18. And as I had indicated in book 19, that Mr. Pontellier is so shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties, that he wonders if she's mentally unstable. He even calls a doctor to talk about that. This is when, shortly thereafter, in book 21, Edna learns that Robert is writing letters about her to Mademoiselle Reisz, which of course excites Edna because she's increasingly finding that she isn't just infatuated with Robert, she's in love with Robert. Quite hurt she is that Robert had left town. And then in book 22, Mr. Pontellier visits a physician about Edna because she's making him, this is a quote, uncomfortable, unquote. The doctor wonders if a man is involved, but out of decorum, he doesn't state his concerns out loud. The way it's stated is that he knows his Creole too well to be able to ask such a crude question. Again, this is very much a society about appearances. And Edna admits point blank in chapter 23, she's happy her husband is often at work, because if he were home, they wouldn't have anything to say to one another. In other words, they don't really have a connection with one another. And we learn how Edna's father thinks that Mr. Pontellier, Edna's husband, is being way too lenient with Edna. Again, the idea that the husband is a kind of caretaker, that the wife is a kind of property. Even Rochester himself, when he was thinking about Jane, he oftentimes thought about her in the context of property or a prize. Meanwhile, Edna is continuing to enjoy in chapter 24 not only her solitude but the leisure to read. And we know darn well that a book could ruin a girl, which is something that we've been revisiting over and over again over the course of this semester. Edna in chapter 25 begins spending time with a new male friend, Mr. Arobin, who's known to basically have multiple affairs. And Arobin is infatuated with her. And Edna is concerned not about what her husband would think, Edna is concerned about what Robert would think. Think about how scandalous this would be seen at the time, even in today's time. And then in chapter 26, Edna decides to rent and move into a small house that she calls a pigeon house. We know Chopin really enjoys using bird imagery. It's a house that's around the corner that she can afford on her own with a small inheritance and an income she generates from, well, art, selling her sketches. And the idea is, again, that Edna has financial independence. And she's quite pleased to hear that Robert is returning. This is where she can admit that she loves him. And Edna also admits in chapter 27 that many would judge her character as being wicked, but that's not going to stop her actions. When Arobin, the other man, kisses her and she feels passion, she reciprocates, and they consummate their relationship in chapter 28. And Edna feels regret, not because she's cheated on her husband, Mr. Pontellier, but she regrets her lover isn't Robert. Again, how scandalous for any time. And in book 30, Edna turns 29. The late 20s for female, even in today's time, is a rather significant time. We saw a bit of this in Persuasion, but especially the 29th year, which is right before the age of 30, where a woman might be considered to be no longer young, is, I think, important when Edna turns her 29, knowing that 30 is the next number. When Mr. Pontellier finally learns that Edna's intention is basically to leave him, to move out of their home, he's not concerned that she's abandoning him or the family. He's concerned about what the neighbors will think, and perhaps they're experiencing some sort of financial decline. I can't help but think of Sir Walter in Persuasion. So basically, Mr. Pontellier creates this fiction that there are all kinds of renovations that need to be done in the house, and this is why Edna is moving out. So again, we see how important appearances are during this time period. When Robert finally returns home in chapter 33, Robert visits Edna and sees Arobin's picture in Edna's house, and he's jealous. So now basically Arobin and Robert are foils to one another. So Edna does have the opportunity, which she seizes, in chapter 36 to kiss Robert. And this is where they admit their love for one another. And it seems as if they're going to have a romantic and fulfilling relationship. Shortly thereafter is when Edna is summoned to Madame Ratignolle's for her birth. Madame Ratignolli, as you know, has children on a fairly regular basis, as is expected of a mother woman. And in chapter 37, this is where Madame Ratignolli wants Edna to witness a childbirth, more than anything to shock Edna into thinking about her responsibilities, Edna's responsibilities to her own children. Madame Ratignolli is quite well aware that Edna has at least thought about straying, and definitely does not want to live the life of the wife and mother that society expects of her. And Ratignolli tells her, think of the children. This is the way that this text is different in some ways from The Story of an Hour. The Story of an Hour was less complex because we don't have children involved. This makes certainly Edna a much grayer character. One might say that we can empathize with her desire to break free of her marriage, but yet she still has responsibilities to her children. So this is not an uncomplicated read. Ultimately, when Edna returns home after the childbirth, 38, she sees that Robert is left, and he's left her a note saying goodbye because he loves her. So he understands that he can't compromise their relationship. And theirs being Edna's and her husband's. And so he leaves, saying that because he loves her, he's going to do the right thing, which is not necessarily within his character, at least based on what we're told about with his previous actions. And Edna decides at that point and that she can't sacrifice herself for anyone, that while she's devastated that Robert left her, that eventually she'd become unhappy with Robert, that really she's not looking for marriage or relationship. She's looking for independence and self-actualization. And that's something that Robert wouldn't be able to offer her, just like Mr. Pontellier wouldn't be able to offer her. And that she's not willing to sacrifice herself for anyone in chapter 39, not even her own children. Remember, she said she would die for her children, which some see as the ultimate sacrifice, but not for Edna, because she still wants to keep her sense of self. So what she does at the end, and again, if you haven't finished reading the book, you might want to stop the video right here at 30:30, because I'm going to give some spoilers. That what ends up happening at the ending of the book is that Edna undresses and she goes into the sea naked, the idea that she's no longer subject to the restrictions of clothes or the conventions of society, and she swims until she is exhausted. And we aren't told exactly what happens. We're going to have to put the pieces together, so to speak, just like Joy That Kills in The Story of an Hour. But if she swims out as far as she can and she's exhausted, well, then ultimately she's not going to have the strength to be able to swim back. In other words, she drowns. She commits suicide. So that's the ending of this particular book. And again, you can see how The Awakening and also The Story of an Hour end with the death of our female protagonist. And we're not supposed to be supportive of that. We're supposed to rebel against that, about a society that offers so few options for female that death is really the only way that female can achieve independence. So that said, that gives you a good idea of The Awakening. Not that we're done talking about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is, again, a brutal and ugly read, but important in terms of understanding our history and understanding our progression. So if you haven't finished reading either Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening, this is the time to do it. I am assuming that you have read everything up to this point. And on Thursday, I'll be posting indicating that it's the 4th of July, so we won't be having a class. And then on Tuesday, we'll have our last class where we put some closure onto the Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, some closure onto The Awakening, talk a little bit about the final paper and the final exam. And then, of course, we move into the final exam. So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye. Oh, and again, the attendance question, I'm so sorry, is about what do you think is the most scandalous act in The Awakening and why? That would be due by July 4th. Which is a Thursday, which I know is the 4th of July. If you need more time, just feel free to ask me, and I can give you an extension. So if you need it until Friday the 5th, that would be fine. But our discussion forum question is, what do you think is the most scandalous act in The Awakening? And of course, there are no right or wrong answers, just like there were no right or wrong answers about the most hypocritical act in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. You're not required to respond to your classmates, but certainly do so if you feel compelled to. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, which should not only give you a sense of what we would have talked about in class, but might give you some ideas for your final paper. Take care. Bye-bye.